Trauma. Everyone has it. No one talks about it. It seems easier to stay silent, ignore it, or stuff it than it does to honor it, learn from it, and finally heal. Trauma is debilitating, yet so often we suffer in silence. Trauma is not meant to be battled alone, and we are no longer going to suffer in silence. Together, we are creating a safe place to speak, to share our stories, and grow our strength as we heal. Together, we are giving a voice to those who have been silenced, bringing darkness into light, and letting God use our stories. Today, we find ourselves again. We relight our spark and let it light up the world. Stop Sis is a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating on issues of trauma and trafficking, as well as the amazing power of the healing journey. Welcome to Stop Sis. Hey, you guys. Big welcome back to Stop Suffering in Silence. My name is Denise Walsh. And today we have a conversation, or we're about to have a conversation with you that honestly probably doesn't happen enough. Mm-hmm. We, in our society, oftentimes isolate, shame, shun those who are experiencing some sort of maybe negative coping skill, negative habit, or a sin, as the church would call it. And it's really black and white type thinking, like, don't do this, it's sinful. Okay, goodbye. And today we're going to talk about it because there's a lot of reasons why, there's a lot of habits that need to be broken. There's a lot of conversation that needs to be had, not just stop. Okay, goodbye. Because if it were that easy, nobody would have a negative coping skill or negative habit, and we would all be living our dream life, right? So we know that that's just not how it works. And our next guest is going to talk about her truly lifelong addiction to masturbation, pornography, and how that it has evolved in her life to where she was able to stop and now reach back down to others who are experiencing an addiction of similar sorts and share what she's learned on her journey. So we're going to talk a bit about how that started, but then also the pivot point of when she decided to go to make a change, and then how the healing journey went from there. Before we introduce her into the program, I'd love for Rachel to share a bit about how and why she decided to invite Rachel to speak with us today. I'm sorry, Danielle, our guest, to speak with us today.
Yeah, so Danielle is the worship leader at the church that I attend. And I have to say, like, from the very beginning, when we started going to the church and I saw Danielle up there singing, you can just feel the presence of God within her. Like, it is beautiful to get to worship with her. Like, yes, she has an amazing voice, but her spirit is just unbelievable. And I remember thinking from the very beginning, I want to be her friend. And I wasn't always as brave as I should have been to go up and talk with Danielle in the beginning. But through the last few months, I got to hear a bit of her testimony, and it blew my mind, because it was like, yes, this is a problem that is not talked about. And it is just hearing about her suffering in silence broke my heart. And seeing the transformation that came for her once that silence was broken was like, yes, this needs heard. So, I mean, I can go back and remember survivors in my life who it seemed like it was either one or the other, like completely addicted to pornography and masturbation, or wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. It was like, it seemed to be one or the other with their coping skills. But of course you see shame for the one who is addicted versus the one who can figure out a healthy way of having relationships, like within a marriage or whatever. So I just thought it was super important. I know that people struggle with this, but it's so scary to talk about. And Danielle, you are a brave soul. And I am so stinking thankful that you're willing to talk about this with us and share the hard truths.
Yeah.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah, you're right, Rachel. We've talked to people within our programs who struggled with it
Yeah.
after their trauma. And so we know it's not an isolated incident. It's certainly something that is happening more often than we talk about. And I know, Danielle, that was one reason why you stayed suffering in silence for so long. It's because you felt isolated. So let's start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about how this journey started for you.
Yeah. So I grew up in a Christian home. Um, my parents, wonderful people. I have four older brothers. But one thing that came with four older brothers in the house, pornography was talked about a lot because there were four boys. But it was always kind of focused more towards them, and their struggles. And I never really fully understood what pornography was like fully. I just thought, okay, boys look at pictures of girls and they're not wearing clothes. And I didn't understand that there was a physical component that went alongside that. Um, I had started struggling with masturbation at a very young age when I was around 4 or 5 years old. So, really, yes, as long as I can remember, I struggled with masturbation. I just didn't know what it was. I just thought that it felt good. I was a kid. Um, and so I didn't really think there was any reason to talk to anyone about it. I didn't know what it was. Um,
Well, and at that point too, you didn't know that it was like not an approved action, I guess.
yeah, I didn't know that it was wrong.
Right. And then one question I have really quick is you mentioned struggle. So it sounds like did they struggle with pornography, your brothers, or was it just talked about in this black and white, don't do it? Or
Um,
was there, do you know?
that's some of them did. I wouldn't want to like get into that because that's their story. But yeah, there was definitely there were talks surrounding that, but it was always checking in on my brothers. How are you doing with it? Because my parents were aware that my brothers had, like friends who maybe would introduce them to it. If they didn't find it in the home, they certainly could have found it outside of the home. Even though we were a homeschooled family, there were still, neighbor kids and stuff that my parents were aware they were not believing families, and you can't know what your kids are getting introduced to. So my parents did a regular check-in like with them, to talk about that. Like I remember conversations being had around the topic of pornography, but just having no clue really why boys looked at these pictures. Like I didn't understand it. So then if you fast forward to high school, I had my first boyfriend when I was 15, 16. Well, I was 15 when we started dating. And one thing that happened through that relationship, one of our points of tension was that he did struggle with pornography. And again, I was very sheltered, homeschooled, didn't understand pornography. And so I was just so angry at him the whole time. I just did not understand. I'm like, why does he have this urge to look at pictures of naked women? It just doesn't make sense. Again, because I didn't know there was a physical thing that was happening alongside of that. And then when I was 16 years old, I was with another homeschooled friend of mine, at the library, and we were just being, high schoolers, and we found like a little book of terms, like sexual terms to explain to kids. And I didn't know when we picked up that book that I would find in that book something that I didn't know. And that was the definition of masturbation. And it said in the definition, most often is accompanied by pornography. And it was like, it clicked in my head, what I had been doing. And even though I didn't have the pornographic oh my gosh, component at that time, um, I just had this huge wave of guilt rush over me because at that point, I had broken up with my boyfriend over pornography, and I felt like such a hypocrite. And that's where Satan, in my mind, just started beating me down and saying, like, you were doing the same things. This thing that you were yelling at your boyfriend about all these years, you did the same thing. And I just didn't know. Like, I remember my heart sank in that library when I was holding that book and I read that definition, and I was like, I'm the worst. Like I felt like the worst person. And all of a sudden pornography made sense. All of a sudden it was like a real struggle that I understood that boys went through, because at that time I thought it was just something that boys did. But then it threw me into this world of fear where I didn't know how to talk to anyone about it, because I knew pornography was sinful, because the Bible says, to not lust. I had heard it all, growing up with my parents, with the conversations. And so I knew clearly this was sinful if it was something that goes alongside. And so that shame and that guilt that I felt prevented me from talking with anyone about it for a really long time. I think that the first time that I ever really talked to anyone about it was like a friend at a sleepover, and I was maybe around 17, 18, so like a year or two after. And I told them about it, and I remember they kind of like got this weird face, and just like, oh, okay. Like, and they just didn't know what to do with that information. And I was like, okay, I'm never going to talk to anyone about it again because that was the worst. She didn't know what to say. It just affirmed in my mind that I was alone, that I was weird. And by that point, when I had told her, after I had found out what masturbation was and that it went along with pornography, the other thing that had happened in my mind was the devil basically was like, well, if you're doing one part, why not do the whole thing? And so that's when pornography started to come in, where I'm like, well, if this is something sexual, then maybe like I should just go ahead and do the whole thing because it doesn't matter. And I felt at that point I had been so trapped in it for so long, there was no hope of getting out. And so I was like defeated before I even started fighting. And so that's when I started looking up things. And this is something that I often tell people when I tell my testimony. It's not like I was on Pornhub or something, like, or on the dark web. I was on YouTube. And all that it was were clips and scenes from a lot of movies that people own, like romance movies. It didn't have to be anything like super graphic. And I think that that's something that was challenging to me and convicting to me, is it's just, there's pornography everywhere around us. Like, it doesn't have to be just on the dark sides of things. Like it's on your shelf at home, and easily accessible to anyone, to your kids on YouTube. And we have, like, for me, growing up in this culture of, I think like my generation was one of the first ones to grow up with iPhones. Like in high school, I got my first iPhone when I was 13, and my iPhone was the source where I would get all those things right on my YouTube app. Sorry, collecting my thoughts.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're at now. Like, I know I'm terrified for my kids to have a phone because of that reason. And I had a neighborhood friend, like a neighbor whose son was going to buy a friend a gift, and so he looked up, a gift or girl gifts or something like that, and porn popped up, and he was like 8 years old, and your brain at that age that you were was not fully developed. Like, to see all of us, whatever we see at that, it's traumatizing. It messes with the wiring of your brain. And then you do feel captive to it.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think for me as well, it was a bit of, again, growing up in like a sheltered home where these things weren't talked about. It like opened up this curiosity in me as well of like, well, how does all of this like work? And then that also spurred me on to like look things up, which is horrible, but I don't know. I was just trying to fully understand it, because I felt like that moment when the book fell open and I saw or not fell open, but when we found in that book at the library, the definition, it was just like, I felt like my eyes had been opened and I was like, oh my gosh. And so it's just like, when you're defeated and when you're like, I don't know, like, I'm never going to get out of this anyway, curiosity or whatever it is can just like push you forward into that deeper and deeper. But then there came a whole new level of shame once I had started the pornographic side of things, where I knew I had thrown myself deeper into it. And again, I just didn't know how to talk to anybody about it.
Did you happen to have a youth group leader or anything at church? Did they discuss this type of stuff, or was it kind of one of those taboo topics that you don't talk about?
I did have a youth group I love my youth group. My youth pastors were amazing. But again, like in my church growing up, this was only ever talked about as something that men struggled with. So again, it just affirmed in my mind, I'm the odd one out. I'm weird. Nobody else struggles with this. So I'm just not going to talk about it. And none of my other friends had ever brought that up to me as something girls struggled with. Even my friend groups, they're all talking about boys struggling with pornography. And so it was fear for a long time that kept me trapped. And like I said before, that one girl that I told, her reaction just affirmed that in my mind, that I was weird. And I'm like, I don't want to tell anyone ever again. But when it changed, so I guess the turning point for me, there were many, but the first one for me was when I met my best friend. And I know she won't care if I say her name, my best friend, Ariana. She is wonderful. And I actually met her through a boy I was dating at the time. And I remember there was a time that we were hanging out, and she told me, there's nothing that you could ever tell me that could ever make me judge you in any way, because she had her own story, her own past and those things. And she had that knowledge of who am I to judge. She had come to a saving relationship with Jesus, and she knew the grace that he had shown her. And she was like, why would I not show someone else the same grace that he has afforded to me? And when she told me that, I remember feeling super hesitant, because she could tell there was something on my mind. And it was, one, that struggle with masturbation and pornography, and two, how that had now bled over into the relationship with the boy I was dating, the boy who had introduced me to her, because it transitioned to there, because Satan just kept doing his thing. And when I started dating him, it's like, well, you're doing it on your own. What's the difference if you do it with someone else? It just got worse and worse and worse. And it was this huge snowball that I just didn't know how to talk about. And I remember thinking like, okay, like I can tell her, I'm going to tell her, let's just see what happens. And I cried and I told her. And the whole time that I told her, her facial expression did not change. She had the same look of love and acceptance the entire time that I told my story. And when I finished, she said, I think there are way more people than you realize who struggle with that same thing. And I had never heard anyone say that before, like way more women who struggle with that than you think. And I was kind of like, it was just that comfort from her to know that someone wasn't going to like judge me or treat me differently. And that she even would like encourage me with that in that time. And she came alongside me as a friend, and she would consistently check in on me and say, hey, like, how are you doing? How are you and your boyfriend doing? Like, because she knew that I wanted to stop. It was a struggle. I really wanted to stop. I just was trapped in that loneliness and isolation. And she was the first one to pull me out of that, to say, I'm going to come alongside you and I'm going to be with you in this. She was not afraid to give the hard truths. She would come to me with, with scriptures to challenge me, to try to encourage me out of it, not to convict me, but just to challenge me and to point me back to the better way that God had for me in my life. And ultimately what that led to was we had started a Bible study with Ariana and her husband, Paul. And we decided in this Bible study that we were going to start, it was with a close group of friends, and we were all going to start by sharing our testimonies, which I had never done before. I didn't even think I had a testimony. I was like, whatever, I grew up in a Christian home. Like, I've always pretty much known who Jesus was. And she told me, like, no, you do have a testimony, and I think that you should share it. And I'm like, what do you mean? She said, well, everything that you're struggling with, you should share it. And I'm like, that's a current struggle. I can't currently talk about a victory. It's not a testimony. It's like shameful. It's sinful. And she said, no, like, you should talk about it. And so I mustered up all the courage I had on the night when it was my turn to tell my story and my testimony. And I confessed to this room of my friends, my struggle with pornography, with masturbation, my struggles with my boyfriend. I told them how I just knew that I was weird, and, that it wasn't something that girls struggled with. And then my friend who had come with me, who actually was not a Christian, she just came with because she was on her own journey seeking God. She stopped me when I said that, and she goes, girl, pretty much every girl I know struggles with that. What are you talking about? And I'm like, what? And she's like, yeah, like all of my friends have struggled with at least masturbation, if not pornography. Like they all do. And one by one, every girl in that room that I shared my testimony with, every single one of them said, I struggled with that too, or I'm currently struggling with it too. And it was the most liberating feeling that I had ever had, because now it wasn't just a friend telling me, I think maybe people have struggled with that. It was like, no, these people really have, like these women really have, and I'm not alone in this. And it makes me
I think God purposefully placed all those people in that room. Like that is amazing.
Absolutely. And it makes me think of in James 5:16, it says to confess your sins to one another so that you may be healed. And that was something that I experienced in that moment, was I confessed it. And that was the first moment that I felt any trace of healing, any trace of, I could get out of this. I could get on the other side of this, because there are women in there who are currently struggling and women who had come out of it. And so it gave me people to talk to, of like, well, how did you get away from it? Like, what worked for you? It created this level of accountability that I didn't have before. And I am so grateful. And I agree with you, Rachel. I do believe God just gave me that, because I know certainly not every woman in the world struggles with this, same as not every man in the world struggles with this. But he gave me, for that night, every girl in that room had some kind of past with that, or present with that. Yeah, so that was the first huge turning point for me in my struggle with it. It was not the end of it. It was just from that point I was like, okay, like I can fight this. And so I went at it with a different attitude, where it wasn't defeated before I had even started. It was, okay, I'm going to fight it. And I still lost a lot of battles along the way. But the mindset had changed of like, whenever I would struggle with it and I came out of it, it was like, you don't have to do this. Like, you are more than this. And I knew that God could ultimately heal me and get me through it. And I wanted to focus more on him, getting my eyes back on the Lord and his word. And one of the primary ways that I did that was through my journey of becoming a worship pastor. And that started through my worship pastor at church came to me and offered to apprentice me. And I remember when he asked me, because I was dating that boy, I was in the midst of my struggle, thinking, I'm not a worship pastor. Like, I can't do that. And there were so many reasons as to why I thought I couldn't do it. But I'm like, it's kind of just like, who am I to step into that world of things when I'm in the midst of such a struggle? But my parents encouraged me to go ahead and do it. And they, at the time, they knew nothing about my struggle. I hadn't opened up to them about it. But I prayed about it and I was like, like, I want to do it. Like, there was this tug on my heart of like, I think I'm supposed to do this. So I began an apprenticeship with him, and I was in that apprenticeship for 2 years. And those 2 years changed my life in more ways than I could ever say. And I'm so grateful to my worship pastor for that time, because through those 2 years, this calling was placed on my life, and I knew I was supposed to be a worship pastor. It put a pull in my heart to go to school for it, and I eventually ended up going to Visible Music College and got my bachelor's in worship leadership. And it's while I was there that I found freedom from my struggle, and that came. I was still dating that boy when I first started going to college. He and I struggled the whole time we were together. But to not like get too much into that, the long and short of that is he was not really very supportive of my desire to go to college to get my degree. He thought it would postpone our plans to get married, even though I don't think we ever really were going to get married. We've been dating for a long time. And obviously we didn't get married. But I came to a point in my relationship with God where God was like, are you going to do what he wants you to do, or are you going to do what I want you to do? Because I have given you a call on your life. You are to become a worship pastor, and he's not supporting that. And that came from my worship pastor told me the same thing. And it was like this realization, like my worship pastor at the end of my apprenticeship with him, he looked me in the eyes and he said, Danielle, I'm terrified that you're going to marry this boy and never become a worship pastor. Because if you marry him, that's never going to happen. And he's like, and I believe God has more for you than that. And that it kept going through my mind. And while I was at school, I was like, this is true. Like, I have to choose, and it's this boy or it's God. And I could not choose God at that point. I'm like, I have to go with what the Lord has said. I have to put God back on the throne of my life and stop letting a relationship determine what I do or don't do. So that relationship ended. It was a mutual breakup between the two of us. We knew it just wasn't right. And then I actually very shortly after that met the man who's now my husband. He was at college at our campus. It's a very small campus. There are actually only 20 of us at the Chicago campus of Visible Music College. So
wow.
I did not go there expecting to find my husband, but I did. Very quickly after like my breakup, I was free to hang out with boys again. I started hanging out with him, and I was like, this guy is so funny. He is so fun. Like, I feel like he would be my best friend if we hung out, and he is. And so once he and I started dating, like, I was completely open and transparent with him about my story, about where I was coming from, about even my current struggles. He offered me the same grace that Ariana did when I told her my story, and he did not judge me for any of it. But I remember the last time that I went to look at pornography, I had looked it up, and I felt the Lord, like, in my mind say, like, I have given you a fresh start in so many ways. Would you let me give you a fresh start here too? Because do you really want to carry this with you now into this new relationship, into this new chapter of your life? Because you could be free. And in that moment, I deleted the YouTube app off of my phone. And I said, I don't even want access anymore. I don't care if there are things on YouTube that are fine, like there are funny videos and stuff. I'm like, at that point, I'm like, I can't have it because it's too much of a temptation. So I deleted it off of my phone. And that was the last time that I ever went to struggle with it. Praise God.
Yes. Holy cow.
Did not have done that without him. So, but yeah, that was my moment. Mm-hmm.
I know, like, whenever I talk to survivors or just people in general, almost everybody, I mean, you have your identity in something or someone or whatever. And like, for example, I heard from a survivor just this last week, and she's like, I feel like, my identity is in serving men. And how do you suggest somebody, like, the way that you transformed your thinking, the way that you got yourself out of this addiction, what would you say to some of these survivors who are struggling with the same struggles you had, or even another addiction, that they want to shift their identity, but they feel stuck?
I think that it's learning partially to filter out the voices that are in your head. I know in scripture it says to take captive every thought. And so that was something that my thoughts were where I was trapped in. I definitely felt, I know at that time for me, I was finding my identity in the relationships I was in. I was a very like romanticized person. I was all about like Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy stuff, and I just wanted to find my husband. That was all I wanted out of life. And I had to realize that there was so much more that I could find the fulfillment that I had been seeking in relationships with men, that for me, like that I found that in God, in my relationship with him. And the more that I filled up with him and spending time with him in his word and prayer with other believers, encouraging me, like in those moments of sharing my testimony and not being judged, through that, it was filling me up with a different kind of strength that I didn't have when I was alone. I truly believe we're not meant to carry any of those things alone. I think isolation is the biggest thing. So when someone is in the midst of a struggle, whether it's with pornography or something else or addiction, it's what are you filling yourself up with? What are you looking to satisfy? Is it those things? Because that's what it was for me. For me, if I wanted to be satisfied, I went and looked up porn and masturbated. But if you can change your focus and truly want to desire, you desire something different, something more. There's nothing like Jesus. Like, I don't know how else to describe it, but like when you know him and you know that he loves you, that he wants you, I was able to get to a place where I was good with breaking up with my boyfriend, even though I was so dependent on him at the time. But I was at peace with breaking up with him because I knew I had God and that I was going to be okay.
So God had to be enough.
Yeah, God has to. He has to be enough. And that was the same with last time that I ever went to struggle, where he's just saying, like, would you let me give you a fresh start here too? He had given me a fresh start in so many ways in my life. And I had to release that to him too.
I have a few questions because there may be people out there that are like, what is the big deal with porn? Like, why is this a big deal? What would you say, like, how did it bleed into your relationships? How did it bleed into your identity? Besides it being, a sin, and how else did it negatively impact you?
Yes, I think that it gave, for one thing, it gave unrealistic expectations of relationships, because how it's portrayed in movies, which is what I was turning to, is just not how it is in real life. It's romanticized. I don't know it's romanticized. Yeah, I guess it's just the word. But so it gave really unrealistic expectations, which I then would carry to whoever I was dating at the time and be like, why don't you behave this way or act this way? But beyond that, like if you look just at pornography as an industry, this is something Rachel and I were talking about when I sat and talked with her. Like, it's like, what was it? You said like 90% of the women in that industry are being trafficked.
Yeah. They don't want to be there. They maybe are posing like they want to be there, like they're the girlfriend, but they don't want to be there.
Yes. And it's absolutely despicable, just that industry, like what is being done to these women. And I know I did meet at one point a young man who he never struggled with pornography. He had been shown pornography and he felt horrible for the women. And he's like, why would I want to watch this? Like, what are they doing to her? Like, does she want to be there? Like, and he was asking those questions. And I think a lot of people don't ask those questions. They think like, oh, they're making good money or whatever. It's talked about lightheartedly when it's really a horrible thing. Whether it's women or children, it's horrible.
Well, and I can honestly say from experience on the other side of the camera, it is not at all like what you would think. Not at all. And, like, oftentimes porn is seen as the sin that doesn't hurt anybody. Well, but you don't realize the hurt that's taking place behind the scenes. And so, yeah, it is near and dear to my heart to not only stop it from even being accessible, even these, women being exploited, children being exploited. Like, I want all of that to stop. I want our children's minds to be protected, because as soon as you see that, you are forever changed. Like, I mean, God can absolutely redeem you and restore you and rewire your thinking again, but it'll be a journey, like it's not going to be a snap of the fingers. Like, it will change you. And so the protecting of our kids from when, like we were talking about, Danielle, you walk in the mall, you walk past Victoria's Secret. I mean, like, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
So how did you begin the healing process, or the freeing yourself from the addiction? What are some steps one could take if they have either the similar addiction or addiction to anything that would aid their journey?
I think for me, the first step was to rid myself of any access to anything that I had been using for that. So for me, it was just the YouTube app on my phone. So I deleted the YouTube app, and then the device that I'd been using to masturbate, got rid of that as well. So first you want to just remove access from that. Second, you definitely want to have your people with you who go on that journey with you, people who genuinely are going to hold you accountable in love. Because there are people, honestly, there are people who mean well, who try to come alongside someone as an accountability partner, but they don't fully grasp what it is they're doing. And that can be hard too, because you feel like, okay, you're supposed to be holding me accountable. Where are you? So find someone who is dependable, who really is going to check in on you, who will always point you back to truth. The truth that you don't need to go to that anymore, that there are different things that you could do. People who are going to suggest like, okay, so say I'm really struggling and I'm going, oh my gosh, like I really want to turn to porn right now. Somebody says, well, come over. Let's hang out. Let's play a game. Let's, watch a movie or something. Someone who's going to be with you in the midst of that, who you feel safe to take it to, and who is going to support you in the right ways.
Did you create a list of things to do when you felt the desire or craving to come on?
For me, if I'm getting like totally transparent, for me, it would happen in the shower. And so if I felt like the desire to do that, I would refocus like my thoughts and go, just finish, like wash your conditioner out of your hair and get out. And I would have to like tell myself that, where it's just like, okay, get out. Like, this is not like, because you have to take showers in life. You have to. So I had to really like like I said earlier, like taking my thoughts captive. So when the thoughts would creep in of like, okay, like you're alone, like it's like, no, like get out of the shower.
You had to catch it and then intentionally change it. Because I think that's the thing. It's oftentimes we can entertain it, or we could, but capture it, intentionally change it. And then the other thought too is focusing on other ways to spend your time, or what else could I do when I'm feeling anxious or depressed or lonely or whatever. Because I think because when we're like, there's two ways we can go always, right? We can either focus on what we don't want and saying, how do I stop this? Or we can focus on what we do want and say, how do I start doing more of these things? And even if we were to say, like, if you think of somebody who's smoking, like, how do I stop smoking? And you're always focused on not smoking, you are going to be smoking. Because like you can't focus on not smoking and not smoke, like, because you're just always thinking about it. So instead of focusing on not, rather focusing on what can I do instead, and really like going to that list every single day, or timing yourself and taking this quickest shower ever, or I don't know, other ways, right? So you're not focusing on not doing the thing you don't want to do. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that was something that I would like take my thoughts and go, okay, like what am I doing when I'm done with my shower, and like shift to that and be like, okay, like I'm going to so-and-so's house, or I'm going to clean my room, or I'm going to watch a movie, or like watch the next episode of that show I've really been enjoying, but just to refocus.
Yeah. And then
because you can't take something out without replacing it with something. And sometimes people go from one bad habit to another bad habit. So you really have to be intentional about filling that blank spot with something good and healthy and of God.
I love
easier said than done.
Well, I love your idea of saying, okay, well, what else? Like, you're, instead of ruminating on that specific moment, really getting your mind to the next thing, because that next thing is exciting, and it's motivating, and it's you're drawn to it, right? So you're like, finish this fast, let's go, we're going to have fun now, and not staying in this stewing type place.
Yep, absolutely. And something that I did as well a few times when I was feeling the struggle is I would turn on my audio Bible on my phone, and then I would just listen to that, because then also, because my phone was the device I would use, that device is now being used to read me scripture and to fill me up with that. And I would just listen to that. And that was a way as well to get my mind off of that and on to something else, something good.
That's
So,
awesome. Okay, so I have like a super controversial thing to bring up.
yes.
Um, like it seems like we've gone from one extreme where, it's not talked about at all to almost the other extreme where let's just like have it in our kids' textbooks and let's teach them what it is in kindergarten and so what the heck, first of all? Like I know some of these schools in the public school system and what they're teaching the kids, and I'm like, you are only bringing to their attention what they are now going to struggle with. But however, you can't be silent about it either. There has to be a way to do this appropriately.
Mm-hmm. That's a
Thoughts?
hard one. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really hard one to navigate, because, it's something that I really wish had been talked about, especially in my church. And that's something that I do feel now. It is in our schools, it is surrounding our kids and all these other places, but the church still doesn't really talk about it in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So it is being fed to the kids, but it's being fed to kids in the worldly perspective of it. They're being handed condoms where it's assumed you're just going to have sex because you're in high school, rather than the kids being taught. Like this was something that I had wished like there had been more conversations in my youth group or in my household about God made sex. What is sex for? What is it supposed to be? Because it's good. There is an entire book, Song of Songs, that is very much so about sex and sexual interactions. But it's this thing of, I think a lot of Christians know like, oh, it's bad to have sex outside of marriage, but they're not told why. Like why? And for me, having done things with someone who is not my husband, there was pieces of me that I felt were taken and left there. I had opened myself up to be very vulnerable with someone who ultimately hurt me. And there was a lot there that I had to heal from, things that, even with my husband now, like occasionally something will get triggered from that. Something reminds me of that and of the pain. Like sexuality is like, it's called intimacy for a reason. It's very intimate, it's very raw, it's very vulnerable, and you are opening yourself up to so much hurt, so much pain that God does not want you to have. Whereas if if you wait for the person that God has for you and you get married and you can just share that with one person who is going to be loyal and faithful to you, and you can protect that the way that God wants you to, then it's not painful. It's not shameful. None of it, not a bit. It's just good. And it's holy, actually, in God's eyes. I think that lots of Christians, like my fellow sheltered Christian homeschoolers, some of them were afraid of sex. That's also not good. You don't want to be afraid of it. You also don't want to be immersed in it. I think with everything, there's a balance. So talking about it as something that is good, something that God created and the context in which he created it to be in, and telling your kids like there's nothing to be afraid of there, but you need to protect it.
I love that.
I'm no expert on any of that, but that's just where my thoughts go to with that question.
Well, and it reminds me of a podcast that I listened to not too long ago that was really hard for me to listen to, but was very good. It was discussing how like our past sexual struggles or abuse or whatever molds and shapes our thinking of sex. And then without meaning to, we pass that same belief onto our kids. And so a guy shared his testimony of how his dad, you could just see shame on his face if sex was even brought up. And so the boy assumed sex meant shame. And his dad never talked to him about it. And eventually the dad, the son could tell like mom must have prompted him to say something, because the dad was like, do you want me to talk to you about sex? And the son could just tell he was so uncomfortable with the topic. And the son was like, no, I know everything I need to know. So we're passing along to our kids whatever deep feelings we already carry for it. And so it's important to don't put that onto our kids already before they've even experienced it. Like sex is shameful, sex is scary, sex is painful, whatever, we need to show them it is the gift of God, and not exactly what you said, not to be scared of it.
Yeah. I think that's a good thing for like parents to even just ask themselves is like, what mindset do I have about sex that maybe is incorrect or not true? Because your kids will pick up on that. So yeah, like when you're going in to have a conversation, and even with that, I feel like a lot of my friends talk about like when they were traumatized when their parents first came in and gave them the talk. I think sometimes what's better is to just ask your kid, like, do you have any questions about anything?
Because every kid's different at when they should be told, what they should be told, how they should be told.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that was like I know some friends who that's what their parents did, is like, okay, like, you know, I know you don't live under a rock. I know you have friends. Do you have any questions about anything to do with, you know, your body, with sexuality, with any of those things? And maybe let your kid help guide the conversation, because I know for me, I would have appreciated someone just asking me what I was already thinking, because the thoughts were already there. I just didn't know what to do with them, and I didn't have like the proper avenue to talk about it.
And it sounds like it's not a black and white, yes or no, do this, don't do this lecture. It's a conversation, and it's a conversation that keeps happening. It's not a conversation that, all right, let's talk for 10 minutes. Okay, my job's done.
You are not checking a box.
It's a conversation that just create the space for our children to feel comfortable asking us questions if they have them, and knowing that this is a safe conversation to have, and that kind of thing.
And it's likely going to be more than one conversation. So, because they're going to come up at different times, because your kid is ready to talk about different things at different times. So for me, I just didn't feel I had the relationship with my parents when I found out what masturbation was to then go home and tell them that. Because again, we didn't talk about like our bodies or those kind of things. So it was just very shameful. I didn't want to talk about that. So I don't know. I hope someday, and I know I'm going to make my own mistakes as a parent, but I hope someday if I have a daughter and she comes to a discovery like that she would feel safe in coming to me and saying, Mom, like, I read this book at the library today, and there was something in it that I've been doing, and I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know how to feel about it. Because that's really what I needed at that time. I just didn't have at that time the relationship with my mom. I would say I probably do now, but I did not then.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense. Danielle, thank you so much for sharing your story. I know it takes courage for you to share your testimony, but because you are shining a light on this topic, you're giving other people an opportunity to start their healing, the healing process too. So thank you so much for being here today.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this powerful episode of Stop Suffering in Silence. If you are interested in booking Rachel to speak at your school, your church, or on your podcast, then please email openblindeyes@protonmail.com. If you are interested in sponsoring a survivor on their healing journey and would like to donate to Stop Sis, then please check out the link in the description box or show notes below, or you can email stopsis@protonmail.com. And finally, if you are currently suffering in silence, or you know somebody who is, whether they're dealing with a current trauma or one from the past, then we will always recommend that you reach out to your local resources and find a counselor that you can trust, because nobody is meant to suffer alone. Have an amazing week, and thank you for being here.